So I want to present today a work that Charlie Cannon from the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies and myself did in the last year, and that was just published 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks now. I have a copy here if you want to have a look at it. On biomass, forest biomass and bioenergy applications here in the Northeast and potential. Here's also a fact sheet that you can also look at it again if you want to. But I will give you the facts in a very brief overview. I have something like 15 slides here, so and then we can just talk and talk also during those slides. Yeah, so I want to start with a bit of a general introduction on bioenergy, just to raise again the awareness of where we stand here when we talk about bioenergy. World biomass use of energy. Of biomass? Do you have any thoughts about what biomass is used for right now when you think about human societies? What this biomass ends up, where it ends up, for what use?
You got kind of food.
Food, yeah. How could you? Yeah, in these kinds of categories, what else is there? Like fiber for industrial purposes or material, yeah.
Pulp.
Yeah, same thing. Okay.
Construction materials?
Yeah. All in materials.
Firewood.
Fuel, yeah.
Fuel. Dung.
Dung it goes into the fertilizer category.
And also in the fuel.
Fuel, yeah. One thing I think you could say is still missing. Feed.
Feed for animals.
Right? So, let me just go back to this really quick. You have, yeah.
Don't forget our local electric plant.
Yeah, so you have sort of these 5 F's, at least that's what I can come up with. You think about feed for animals, you think about fiber for materials, for any kinds of industrial use, food, fuel, fertilizer. What do you think is the biggest chunk? This is actually a graph here from Krausmann et al., who does a lot of work with Helmut Havel in Austria on net primary productivity and its human appropriation of NPP.
I would guess feed.
Yeah,
Do you think feed? Any other guesses?
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so you're pretty good here. This is actually feed. So just to see the relations again, where the stuff goes right now, and where also this discussion might be going when you start talking about increased use of biomass for energy purposes, and what the big drivers are behind these pictures. If you would increase energy use, how this would influence in the end food. I think there's no question that it competes with food if you have, for example, corn to ethanol systems. But you might talk about fairly small influences in total appropriation of biomass in the end. So I just want to go briefly quick to this slide. So 16% of the world's net primary productivity ended up in some kind of human controlled system in 2000. I think that these are actually 2000 numbers. And 65% of that was used by societies. Yeah.
Sorry, but there was an initial study by Ehrlich and Tusick and so on, 25.
Was it 86 or 96? It was like 86.
Yeah.
It said,
Yeah.
And it got I thought it got a bigger number.
yeah, it got like 45.
So this is a very conservative number. This is very low. Yeah. I have seen numbers that go up to 30+%. And then the 16%. I just want to use this number here at this point because I think he had used a very consistent methodology and very well documented. I can give you the full reference to that. So that's just what I use. I am fully aware that there are huge ranges on how to calculate that, absolutely. And what I want to go after it is actually the next segment here, how much of that was used in societies and how much of that ended up being unused.
Does that mean just waste?
That's the question, what that means. So you go through these systems and you have stuff that goes in terms of forestry, for example, it just ends up in the forest as residues. And 30% of that destroyed in human induced fires. So just as a first overview on where this biomass ends up, what we use here on a global scale to set a bit the stage and put the limits on it. So we talked about this. I'm going to focus now more on the US does any one of you have an idea how much of the energy portfolio in the US is renewables?
About 20%.
20?
I think it's-
What is hydro?
Say again?
What is hydro classified?
Hydro would be renewable. So I'm talking about the whole energy portfolio, including electricity, liquid fuels, all kinds that you would use for as
Well, I was just
primary
thinking of
energy.
electricity.
Say again?
I was just thinking of electricity.
Yeah, don't go beyond electricity.
Huh.
Energy.
I don't know.
It is.
Oh, I think it's 50 energy, I think it's, I forget, I should know, I teach it every year. It's like 5% or something.
15%.
15, 5, one more guess.
I'll say I think 5 is high.
5 is high. So these are numbers for 2007, and that was 6% calculated by the Energy Information Administration. Do you have any guess about the shares of this renewable energy? Where does it come from? What's the biggest chunk? Again, just measured in energy units, not on energy quality or something like that.
Well, hydro and biomass would be the biggest, I think.
Do you think hydro biomass?
Negligible amount would be wind and solar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Biomass would be
Hydro,
the biggest, probably.
Excellent, excellent. So the two biggest chunks are biomass and hydro, and not necessarily those who create a lot of discussion right now, like wind or solar. Where does this? What kind of biomass is that? What do you think?
Firewood.
I bet,
Firewood.
I bet it's half firewood and half electricity production.
Yeah, doesn't the paper industry use a lot of its own biomass?
So it does. Let me ask it in a different way. What kind of biomass is that? Is that agricultural stuff like grass and residues from there, or is it methane from farm production, or is it corn ethanol from corn, or is it wood?
It's traditional biomass.
I'd say wood biomass.
Wood biomass.
Woody biomass.
You are such well-informed people. Normally, I think that these questions or these answers come off very differently. So most of this is actually coming from wood, and most of this is from secondary uses of wood, where wood already went through a supply chain or a production chain and ended up as some kind of residue. So this is the biggest chunk here,
And methane is like third, and then liquids are last, right?
yeah, in this case. So you have gas and then the liquids last. So most of that again is wood, and it's from secondary uses where you had already, like you said, the pulp industry basically creaming off the top of the best uses for it and then burning the rest. So that's where biomass stands right now. And the big question now is how we can perhaps increase use of biomass here in the Northeast. That's coming up in the news all the time. How we can dip into this regional potentially renewable source of energy, and what we can do in the first case to replace liquid fossil fuels. Yeah,
The corn and algae, is that fitting into gas?
Liquid.
liquids.
Liquid?
Yeah, right.
What
So,
else?
say again?
What else?
Yeah, right.
Theoretically.
The virtual algae.
So again, most of this discussion, in my opinion at least, is driven by how to replace oil that is imported, that comes with all kinds of environmental impacts. And this is actually where we started looking at, from which angle we started to work on this study. And this was one of the first results that I created from data from the Energy Information Administration, where we just looked at how liquid fossil fuels, how oil is used here in the Northeast. What's the difference here, do you think, to the Southeast perhaps, or other areas of the US?
Less for heating down there.
Less for heating. Are you
And more
surprised?
for electricity.
More for electricity?
Because, well, oil is, most places use natural gas and coal.
So what would you have guessed if I would have asked you how much oil in Vermont is used for transport on roads and how much is used for heating homes? would have been your guess?
It's right there.
It's right there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
transport is double.
So for Vermont, this is 26% of the total oil used every year here goes into home heating.
I can tell you half the people in Vermont use oil for heat,
Right.
about 56%.
So the question is here now, more from a strategic standpoint, if you think that biomass and the wood biomass from forests is a good resource that should be further looked into, what would you, I mean, what options do you could you have to work on reducing oil consumption here and sort of replacing it with biomass?
Gasoline tax.
In Vermont,
I'm just in Vermont, for example, in Vermont. So what options did you hear about, or what might be on the table here?
I think people talk a lot about using it for electricity, but it would make more sense for heat than, than anything else. I would say.
Right, so you have different scenarios. You could say that we should increase our electricity production and use wood for that. We could say that we want to replace gasoline for cars and use, hopefully in the future, cellulosic ethanol that can be produced perhaps in the future by
You could also make methanol
biomass.
out of trees.
Or methanol, all kinds of sorts of these things, and then actually chop off these larger parts here of the graph, where you have the blue bars that look at ground transport. Or you could think about working on the heating applications and heat more homes with pellets, or have more residential and industrial uses of wood chips, where you heat more schools, where you heat campuses like UVM, or hospitals, any kinds of larger systems. What's the difference between those two that I just tried to describe, where you think about replacing heating oil versus replacing transport, oil for transport?
I'd say it's much more efficient to use for heat
Does it make
than any
sense?
of the others. Because electricity would be lower, and for transportation it would be much, much lower.
You have a higher efficiency, you say. What's the other big thing at least in my opinion?
Less processing to get to that point.
Say again?
Less processing to get to the final end
So
product.
that might influence the efficiency of it, yeah.
Existing industry, it's not enough to create a whole new,
What's here with the time scale?
you could do it right now.
Do you think there's a difference between heating homes with wood versus trying to develop a liquid fuel out of it? Heating homes can be done next winter, to a larger degree at least. When you look at liquid transport fuels from wood, this is still in a fairly early phase of research. Certainly still a bunch of years from commercialization. And when you look at how quick you want to move here, this makes a
Well,
big
except for
impact.
the fact that the Germans did it during World War II, they made methanol out of wood.
But not in a really commercial scale. Outcomes unknown. So, heating oil in Vermont, I just tried to get these numbers out yesterday. This is what is used every year in Vermont for heating homes. Over 12 billion barrels of oil, and at a $92 per barrel, which was the mean for that year, that meant that year, over $1 billion left for one. Gone.
It's just for heating oil.
Just for heating oil. And these are numbers, so that's for the oil price for importing oil. This is not including the
That doesn't include-
costs that were charged for distributing and so on, that might actually have stayed in the state. This is the amount of money that we
That's
have
not the
to spend.
retail price,
That's not the retail
it's the
price.
wholesale price. And
That's
it doesn't
the wholesale
include kerosene, propane, natural gas.
It does not. No,
Right.
it does not. It's just oil. It's
Right.
just oil. So you could now ask, as we just did, do you want to work on this, or do you work on some other options where you think about electricity or liquid fossil fuels? So these were actually the scenarios that we then used for our study. We had two segments in our study where we had, first of all, an assessment of how much biomass is grown in the forests of the Northeast on a sustainable scale, and the second part that was actually mainly my work was looking into these substitution scenarios or replacement scenarios, where we try to look into 6 scenarios that look at heating homes, producing electricity, and producing liquid fuels.
Talking about spent electricity
Yes.
one, did you look at combined heat and power or just?
Yeah, we had several scenarios. We had a scenario where we looked at electricity production at a current efficiency from current technology at 25%, and we looked at a very aggressive efficiency increase up to 40%, and we also looked at combined heat and power where a total efficiency would be up to 80%. With the rest of the that used for heat.
What's the efficiency difference between like pelletized wood and then turning it into a liquid fuel? I mean, are you losing potential energy when you have to go through the process to turn it into?
That is, of course, one of the big outcomes, and we can talk perhaps a little bit later on this during this discussion. The losses that you have in producing a liquid fuel depends, of course, a lot on how you process it. You can roughly say with every additional step in a production chain, you're losing some of the material. So when you think about liquid fossil fuels, you have 2 routes that are discussed right now. One is more a chemical route where you think about gasification of biomass and then transferring this gas through a Fischer-Tropsch synthesis into a liquid fuel. So that's a chemical route, and then you also have the biological route where you try to break down the cellulose, which is a sugar, into a sugar that can be digested by bacteria. The problem is just that cellulose developed over millions of years not to break down by bacteria. Right? So, and during this process, of course, you feed these bacteria with something, and that creates heat, that creates their livelihood, and that's where you start to lose energy. But also through this chemical synthesis system, you need heat to produce the gas and then to transfer it into a liquid. So you have losses there. Yeah. So this is the report published 3 weeks ago, and the 2 big things were, as I said, a forest estimate to define how much biomass is actually there in the Northeastern forest, and the other part, how could that be used in an efficient way to replace liquid fuels and coal. So 2 big things. Now I first want to talk about the forest part and how we determine these numbers on how much biomass is out there. 2 big things that are generally discussed, or general wisdoms on the Northeast here, is that first of all, the Northeast is way below levels of harvest that it could actually accommodate still on a sustainable scale, and this is in the first case, because that a lot of industry shut down. Vermont lost, I think, over 50% of its saw mills and pulp mills in the last 10 or 15 years, and the same is true across the whole region. So you're losing capacity. And the implication here is that you're also not harvesting as much anymore. And the other implication, or the other thing that comes up often, is that the idea is that does anyone know how much forest was in Vermont 150 years ago? How much is there today in percentage?
I think now it's about 75%, and it was about 25%.
So the range, I think, is 75, 80, something like that. And 150 years ago, it was down to
About 25%.
25%, right? So you have here the theory that during this last century, there was a lot of regrowth in forests. There was a lot of clear cutting being done 80 to 120 years ago, and now this forest started to regrow and has reached its maturity now. And here the idea is that, from an ecological concept, that this forest does not sequester carbon anymore, does not grow anymore, because these trees have reached maturity. So with starting to harvest now, you can stimulate additional growth again. This is highly contested. Bill Keaton, for example, here from the Rubenstein School, and I'm working with Bill in his carbon dynamics lab, has gathered data around the globe on old-growth stands. And it's just very clear that these stands still accumulate a lot of carbon and grow by a lot even after centuries of growth. So this whole idea of maturity and that these stands, even after 80 to 120 years, will stop growing is hard to defend.
But does the rate of growth decline? So could you increase
That
the rate?
goes slightly down, yes. Yes. So the goal of the study here was these two parts, the forest-based energy supply. They, Charlie Canham used in the first case data from the Forest Service that produces the forest inventory assessment. This is actually a data set of an inventory for the forest across the nation. This was designed to by the Forest Service with plots across the nation. Each of these plots is sampled the same way, something like every 5 years, and can create this large data set for the whole nation, but also down to a state level with a satisfying statistical certainty to assess how forests change in structure, in growth rates, and so on. So that was our main data set from there, and then for the energy replacement scenarios, we used the Energy Information Administration data sets that are also available online. So I'm just putting out a couple of tables now, and you don't need to look at them too closely or it might become irritating. The big question here is how you make these calculations of forest net growth, how much is actually growing every year in the forest. So on the very left column you have net growth. That is the growth that is the gross growth of the forest minus the mortality minus the harvests. And the second column from the right actually describes you how much, or the very right column describes you how much of the net growth is currently harvested every year. And only of this additional, that part of the net growth that's not harvested, that might be available for additional harvests for biomass. So the interesting thing here with the right column is what? What does that say? Can anyone help me again? Say again?
Maine is interesting.
What is with Maine?
They're harvesting more than the annual growth.
That's one of the outcomes of the studies.
Actually,
And
what's
you can
interesting is they're all pretty big, except for Rhode Island, which, who cares? I've never been in Rhode Island. There's not many trees in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
A lot of water.
Okay, but seriously, I mean, the fact that all of these, 105%, let's say accuracy, maybe 99%,
Right.
but just they're all of order 100% or 50%, right, in that range, doesn't seem to leave a lot of slack.
Exactly.
They're using a lot of.
Exactly. So again, this column to the very right shows you how much of the net growth is already harvested every year.
But let me make sure I understand these columns. The net growth is in the left-hand column, and removals are in the right, the third column, and the difference is the fourth column. The second column.
It's the mortality, the natural mortality,
Which can't be harvested, right?
Oh, okay.
which cannot be harvested, right? So you have, again, I don't want to go too much into detail with these tables because it might be confusing. My main focus is here really on this right column, which says that basically, again, as you say, who cares for Rhode Island, that for all these bigger states, Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, and then a combination perhaps out of Vermont, New Hampshire, and the southeastern New England states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, you have already fairly high percentages of the net growth being harvested every year. So there might be not so much space to get additional cuts going, while not harming the stock, the growing stock.
But if you argued with Keaton and you believed in the saturation effect, and all of these are quote, let's say all of these are quote over mature forests, and the net growth is not that great, and if you started harvesting, you could then take off stuff faster because the net growth would be higher. But
So-
if Keaton is right, then it's really troublesome.
So what Charlie did here is, so just to go back real quick, and then with the next slide we can talk briefly about this, is here a growth estimate. I thought you might be interested in this. This is again, now this is the focus I think you should have on the second right column, which says mean biomass increment, and this is metric tons of dry biomass, no water in this biomass, for each hectare in each year. So you have something in the range of 1.3 or 1.07 to up to 2.08 metric tons per hectare in year growing in the forests. And the difference here is, of course, can be explained to some extent by growing conditions. Maine, of course, has a way shorter vegetation period than the other states. And then also how these forests are composed, and if they, where they are in their how the growing stock is composed, and how they are managed at this point. This is going a little bit into what you just mentioned. Charlie tried to find out here how forests develop over time and how growing conditions change over time. If you have a very young stand, or let's say a medium-aged stand of perhaps 30, 40 years, you have a lot of biomass accumulation in these stands, and this biomass accumulation fades out a bit over time then. It slows down, but it's still there over even after centuries, as data suggests this. But there are also forests that are highly degraded, and where you have fairly old trees, which are very sparse, not very dense, and where you have very low productivity in these trees. And what Charlie tried to accommodate is that there's a dynamic aspect to the whole thing, that when you start harvesting different types of stands, you will also change your overall productivity. So of this net growth, you have right now already current removals. That's this column down here, right? That's what's already harvested right now. That's the mean for the Northeast. You remember this was for Maine 105%, for other states a little bit lower, but let's say something like 50% that's currently harvested. So that leaves you a net current change of the other 50% of net growth. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, okay. So we just want to look at right now at current removals, what's happening right now. Most of that actually goes into saw, pulp and fuel, okay? And another section of that, something like below 20%, is right now is left in the forest as residues, because it's not economical to get it out. Does that also make sense? So we looked at this resource to some extent. How much could you get actually additionally out from the forest with residues? And that's actually this section of the total growth, okay? But there's also more coming out of this section, because when you cut saw timber, and as I described earlier, you have a lot of secondary uses of biomass of forest products. You have a sawmill that produces furniture or whatever, and some of that ends up also in the biomass market. That's this section. So that's what's happening basically right now, including this section, not including this section. And now you're thinking about what could you do with the rest. And what we did here was actually looking at a reduction of this net growth, of this net change that is realistic. What could you think of? Why would we not be able to cut all of this? It sort of says it on the slide, which is help me. What are the factors that could reduce this?
Could be inaccessible.
Inaccessible because it's steep slopes, or it's swampy, or something like this.
State park.
State parks, it's protected,
Riparian.
riparian zone, so you have legal restrictions, you have physical restrictions.
I mean, there's private landowners who just don't want they want their forest.
You have social restrictions, and that actually one of the big factors was here in the Northeast, you have a very high percentage of private land ownership. And the question is, how likely is it that a forest owner who owns only 10 acres or 20 acres of land will actually harvest in this land? Perhaps they have this land because they inherited it, they don't even know exactly where it is, but they still like the idea that they own some forest in the one.
But if it's in current use, it has to be harvested.
It has to be harvested, but if it really comes down to such small scales that it might not be in current use, or it's actually created or it has been developed, and there are houses on 2-acre plots that are still forested, how do you work with this? What's the potential that you might tap into this resource? So you start to cut off of this potential more and more, and we try to find out numbers that are defendable to do this. So there's reserved land, these state parks, not so much national parks here, of course, hiding sites, which are swamps where you should not harvest also for its biodiversity values. Steep slopes, a big chunk actually where you just don't have roads, that actually affects a lot of Maine.
We can bulldoze those through.
Then that is, but isn't there also a reason that there are no roads? Don't you think so? Why are there no roads? I mean, if that would be a productive forest,
Too expensive to build for whatever reason.
Well, the price of
you
wood.
might assume
They
that.
haven't gotten the federal
Roads
government
are
to pay
there.
for it yet.
So you might argue that this is perhaps a chunk that is still available. I might be fine with that. So we just started to use these numbers now to cut that off. And then small parcels, which are really below 20 acres, that's what we just said is probably not available for this. And then additionally, that you even if you would have harvests, you still would leave some of the tops back in the forest, because you're talking here about biomass. It's often high nutrient biomass, where you have a high ratio of bark and leaves and needles, and that's actually what you should leave
It's
behind.
not the same as the one down there.
Cut off, to some extent, right?
Well,
So you end up with this section that might be available in future for biomass, while not reducing your forest growth.
And the high value wood you would apply for sawmills, not for biomass.
Right, yeah, so that's the other thing. Right, I didn't talk about it, sorry. Of course, with this additional growth, you would still think about how can you make the maximum economic benefit out of this for forest owner. And of course, you get much, much more for veneer or a high-value sawtimber hardwood, or even a 2x4 than if you would sell the same biomass for wood chips.
Where does McNeil stand on that graph right now?
I'll bring back McNeil in a second, if that's okay with you.
Before we move on, one thing that's interesting about this graph is that the biomass for energy segment in that we're saying could expand is a higher percentage in that top half than it is in the bottom half, it looks like.
Is that because you saturate the market with a high value wood?
So you're talking about the
Of the additional harvest, which is the high value wood and the biomass for energy, those two,
those two?
yeah, then the biomass for energy looks like it's about half of what's going on there, where it's only like a third or a quarter of what's going on in the bottom half.
Down here?
Yeah.
And you just put those two in relation, is that what you're
I'm
saying?
looking at the ratio of orange to yellow in the
Oh
top
yeah,
and
okay,
bottom.
yeah. So high value wood, biomass, I see, yeah. So this, it's a good question.
But it kind of makes sense. I mean, current removals now are going to be focused on high value
Right.
wood.
You-
That's what I'm saying,
To
yeah.
some extent, this
So
affects the, I mean, when you think again about where do you have current cuts, these are the high value trees. your
Yeah.
cuts are always driven by where you get your saw timber out. And only if this is feasible, if this is economically feasible, you also think about taking out additional products in the same go. So this, to some extent, accommodates this change of products, of forest products, with getting in additional for additional cuts. And this is now where McNeil comes in again. So these are the same numbers as I had here before, right? Think again, there's over $1 billion spent every year in Vermont to heat homes. What we calculated based on this former graph here for Vermont was that there's probably less than 200,000 metric tons of dry biomass that could be additionally available for any kinds of bioenergy in the state. And this is actually where McNeil comes in. So there's a policy in Vermont, the 25 by 25 policy, which the goal of this policy paper, described in this policy paper, is that by 2025, 25% of the energy of Vermont should be renewables. And they then put this into categories, and they also describe what role biomass should play. They say that biomass should be doubled to reach this goal. Now I looked up the numbers for McNeil, because that's just, I think, something that you can take. Every one of you knows McNeil, the power plant here in the Intervale that produces 50 megawatts of power, mainly by wood chips. Net productivity, I think, is 50. So McNeil alone consumes already 300,000. And there's something like 30% of the schools heated by wood already in Vermont. So doubling all that, I'm not even talking about home heating here. I'm not talking about these wood chip applications in schools and so on. Doubling might be bringing Vermont into problems. And that means that on again, this heating oil aspect, if you would channel all these 200,000 tons, again, dry metric tons of biomass available into the heating homes section, you would replace something like 30% of this current oil, meaning something of like $130 million carved out of this expense.
Is there any fuzziness in these numbers because of the question of what kind of wood is actually burned, say in a place like McNeil? I mean, they claim it's waste chips and all that. You've already accounted for that.
Part of that.
I mean, with McNeil, you know this better than I do.
No, I don't.
It's a tricky issue. I mean, you can call this a waste wood because it's going through this chain of sawmills, pulp mills, and ends up as a product, as a byproduct, you could say. And of course, you could call this a waste product now, where you do create an additional use out of it. McNeil also imports a lot from New York, so you could argue how this actually imports a lot of wood from New York, so how this actually affects Vermont's woodshed. And that's of course a question now with trade of wood. What's actually the value of thinking about state boundaries here? Why should Vermont try to produce its energy within its state boundaries? Why not tap into the Adirondacks if New York is not making full use of it? Why not import pellets from British Columbia? Why not? Why not?
Well, why not import oil from Saudi Arabia?
Here you go. So it's becoming a question. The deeper you dig into that, the more you realize you have a lot of assumptions that are just set and that can be sometimes very hard to defend.
Let me just say, for you, I'm on the Burlington Electric Commission, and even though I've been there a while, I still don't feel as I understand everything, but there's certainly this warm fuzzy vibe that comes from the company, Burlington Electric, that McNeil is cool and we need more of them. And roughly speaking, I once asked for a quickie calculation by the forester there, and
Yeah.
he said something like 3 McNeils could be supported in Vermont, from Vermont's woodshed. But his numbers, I think his calculation was kind of rough. It looks like you're the most up-to-date one now. You're saying it's even less than that. In fact, it's less than 2. Yeah, less than
Well, but
1.
they've already got a couple other wood biomass plants in Vermont, so.
It's only one other one.
There's one
Okay,
big
okay,
one
I'm
in
just
Rye.
So maybe two, but I agree with
Okay.
this, but.
But anyway, I guess there's 2 ways to put it. One is, maybe we shouldn't make a big deal about the fact that you're all that different from him, but all of them come to the conclusion that we're talking about 2, on the order of 2 McNeils, 1 extra, and we're done.
And that would mean that all the additional available biomass would go to this power plant, right? And even with thinking here about these 13% for heating oil, that would mean that all of the additional biomass would go for heating homes, not for additional electricity creation and so on. And when you look, sorry,
You didn't drop factor 10 somewhere here?
I'm sorry. When you look at the overall energy portfolio for the whole region, the whole Northeast, what came out of this was that biomass, if you would use the most efficient way of biomass, like heating homes or having a combined heat and power system, you would create probably in the most realistic scenario something like 2.2% of additional renewable energy
For the region.
for the whole region, whole energy portfolio.
But you have different results for different states.
We had different results for different states. Vermont in this sense was around 6%, I believe. But the overall picture again looks like the fraction that biomass could deliver to a renewable energy future energy portfolio has its limits. The question now is, what do you take out of this? Does it mean that biomass doesn't make sense? We should drop this. We should look for other solutions because it's useless. It's such a small fraction. Or do you think that the problem is that we just use a lot of energy and we should reduce our energy consumption, and therefore also these renewable energy sources, which are fairly small, would increase in their share over time? We could of course discuss by what extent. Or also what additional sources of renewable energy you could tap into the future, and how a future energy portfolio would look like. Right now you have, for the whole of the US at least, you have a huge chunk of oil and of coal for electricity production, and hydro of course, but it's dominated by a couple of big players. But the future energy portfolio might look very different, where you have a lot of small sources that all add up to the big pie in the end. But for me, for my personal conclusion for that is also that in the first case, and that's nothing new, in the first case you need to work on reducing your energy consumption, and then of course look also for additional fuels and sources.
Let me just ask, is there any way to make this conclusion not so dire by just forestry practice? So again, this net growth we're talking about is of these forests which are fairly mature, right? So if we cut them, we got into that high, well, first of all, there's a big stock of forests out there. If we need all the energy, if we need a lot of energy next year, we can denude the state.
We were just talking about net growth, you're right, yeah, if you would cut it all down,
So
there
it's
would
a lot of
be a lot of available
We're running
for a couple of years, yeah.
But if the increased growth, because we're talking about afforestation now rather than quote most mature forest, that might somehow cancel that.
Increase the net growth.
Yeah, yeah. So in other words, I wouldn't, to what extent you could change this factor of 2 to a factor of X if you started cutting more trees with a deliberate afforestation program. I think I already know the answer. We might get a factor 2 or 3 out of that, maybe. And we make the entire state into a
Tree farm.
Yeah, I was gonna say Schwarzwald.
So,
Black Forest, right?
yeah,
Okay, so,
this is now a personal theory of mine. It might be true that these forests are beyond the maximum productivity that they could produce every year, and that from a standpoint from a forest standpoint of view, you could increase this productivity if you try to create again this growth curve that's very steep in the early to medium ages of a stand.
30 years.
What I think here the issue is that these forests, as I see them, are very low stocked. You have in the range of something like, and I know the metrics now, I don't know it all in English units, but you have something like 150 cubic meter on each hectare stocking here, in average, in the New England states, at least for the hardwood regions here in the New England states. What I know from Germany is that the same number is in the range of 450. So 3 times as high.
Which sorry, what number is this again?
150 cubic meters of stocking biomass in the
Okay.
forest here, hardwoods, versus hardwoods in Germany of 450. A mixture of hardwoods, softwoods there. Germany has better growing conditions just because of a shorter winter in the first case. So you cannot really compare those two things, but what I want to say here is that the stocking is very low. So you might have a forest that is beyond its maximum productivity range, but just by cutting more trees, you would not gain this increase necessarily. What you would need to think about, I think, is also changing your management practices to increase stocking density.
Yeah.
And then you could perhaps think about additional cuts.
Is this
to
your last
it,
slide?
That's the last one. Yeah.
Okay. Because one thing that wasn't on there was the the conversion efficiency in the different uses.
Right.
I mean, that would be really useful because, say, converting to automotive fuel, might be, 5% or something. Heating might be 60%, and electricity might be, whatever it is, 30%. Combined heat and power might be, 60%. Is that in there?
Yeah, it's
Okay,
in.
that's fine. So it would make, with this sort of bleak assessment, it would make a really strong argument not to use it for the lower efficiency uses. And also, it would also make sense not to use biomass for things that have other substitutes. For example, electricity. There's substitutes for producing electricity other than biomass. Maybe it would make sense. And then for transportation, I would argue that internal combustion is obsolete, and that internal combustion is going to be eliminated almost completely from transportation because it's so unbelievably inefficient. And if you don't know the numbers, the gasoline or diesel engine is like 13 to 15% efficient. Electric motor is like 80 to 90%. So you're looking just in the drive system, a factor of 6. So I think internal combustion is going to just disappear out of transportation. So to assume that you're going to just replace all the gasoline and diesel with biomass, to me doesn't make any sense, because I don't think that we're going to be using internal combustion anyway.
So the numbers that I have here, and I can hand you this one slide, this one page here, is how much metric tons of biomass, or how much metric tons of oil can be replaced by 1 metric ton of biomass
In
By-
different uses?
in different uses. And the difference here between producing liquid fuels like diesel through a chemical process or cellulosic ethanol versus the difference of uses it for a heating application is something like a factor of 3. You can have a look at it.
Yeah.
Those were the numbers that we used.
Okay, but that's just
So
for the
that
production
means-
of fuel. You haven't talked about the efficiency in its use. You're just talking about creating the fuel.
I'm talking
Right.
about basically the end use.
Oh, the end use?
It
Do you
is,
count the
yeah.
efficiency of the engine too?
You mean the burning,
Again,
you
the
mean the combustion
burning-
use, not the
Yeah,
transportation.
so how
use.
much metric tons would you need? What I did not include here is actually the energy that's also needed to create, that is used in the whole conversion process. For example, producing these pellets or building this power plant and so on. And I didn't do that because we really
So net energy.
right, net energy, stepped away from a larger life cycle analysis, because then you would also need to include how much energy it needs to deliver a gallon of gasoline to a gas station in one, right?
Yeah, before you guys get into it, I'd say there's room for both of you. I mean, because what I wanna say to you, Gary, is, okay, right, we're gonna go over to electric vehicles, when? It's gonna be a long period, we're talking about decadal.
Well, I think we're gonna have cellulosic ethanol for sooner.
No, I think we're gonna push a lot harder for efficient vehicles, but anyway, I'm happy with the idea that you're looking at oil demand as a transportation, let's say that's we have oil-based transportation. I'm also happy with the idea that you might take directly, say, in the longer run, it ain't gonna be oil-based or fuel-based. And it's okay to put out this report, given the perspective you have, no problem. I have, anyway, I think, you ask how you interpret this. I interpret it as, one of the things is, well, every little bit helps, so, we'll just do this. I guess I'm more of a disaster person. This source sucks, and so the other sources, including hardcore efficiency, is necessary, period. That's my view. And we'll either get there by, end of type.
Now, conveniently, encouraging the utilization of biomass and encouraging the utilization of hardcore efficiency, to a certain extent, can be achieved by the same way, which is making the oil-based fuels more expensive, and both of those push in the same direction.
It's the rest of the diatribe.
You were talking about the difference between the 150 for the US and 450 for Germany, and how does the diversity compare? Because we lost chestnuts, which were like 40% of forest, like 80 years ago. We lost the elms in the 70s, 80s, which was a lot of vertical height. They're also pretty fast-growing trees. So how are ways that we could maybe look at affecting some of the actual forest makeup, maybe increasing another 1 or 2 factor in the efficiencies of the different trees in converting into energy?
And you mean, can you,
Well, 2. The different trees have a different, like they give different energy values, right? Like burning oak versus burning a beech. There's some difference when you've got different growth rates, but you also got different energy potentials there. And then we also have diversity, where we've lost elms, which give us a lot of vertical height in our forests.
I see.
We've lost chestnuts. I know chestnuts they still have in Europe. So
In other words, different kinds of trees.
yeah,
So, you mean how a different composition of the forest could create differences in productivity?
Mm-hmm.
And energy content.
I mean, in general, it's still a very diverse forest here. That's the difference in Germany, where it's a more highly managed forest, and we didn't have as many species to start with because a lot of them were killed during the ice age. In terms of density and energy density, I think you compare the oak with some kind of softwood. When you look at just at a mass unit, like metric tons, you actually have very similar energy content of these two trees. The difference is the density. So that's why metric tons is a very convenient way to use it. In both cases, you have something in the around 18 gigajoule of energy in the wood for metric ton. So there might be ways to wiggle on these numbers and to increase perhaps this primary productivity of these forests. The question is just in what range you are here and what's realistic. And I think the question is also what's your goal here? If you want to reduce energy dependence of foreign and reduce consumption of foreign oil, that creates some implications. If you want to reduce carbon emissions, that's something that I didn't even talk about here today, which opens a whole can of worms in terms of biomass, additional biomass cuts. Do you want to create local jobs and support the local economy? It has a little bit to do with oil consumption as well. That may have huge implications for Vermont
I have
to
a
do it
question.
this way.
That whole high value piece, what if the biomass becomes a high value use? You could tap into that big chunk that's going into furniture, right, and lumber.
That's one of the big questions we had with pulp. The pulp prices and biomass prices are very close by now.
And right now, pulp is a high value use.
No, so pulp is in the range of something like $35 for a short ton, paid for a short ton, and biomass in the range of 25, paid at the plant gate. So, and there were already a couple of instances where that actually reversed, where more was paid for biomass than pulp. So you might actually start talking about a real competition with the pulp market. Of course, the few pulp mills who are still here don't like this development at all. That's actually why biomass development from woody biomass from forests is very, very much contested by the pulp industry in Germany. They put a lot of big advertisement out that no biomass for energy use should be promoted. So that's becoming then a real issue. And if the pulp industry finally breaks away, which would be the worst case scenario in terms of job creation as well, then you could tap into, of course, this segment as well. And we have that actually in the report. And if you would, so again, the whole energy portfolio I said was in the range of 2.2%, what additional biomass could contribute. If the pulp industry would falter and would cease to exist in the Northeast, you could bring that up to a maximum of 5%.
But it's more defendable, to use forest than it is to use food crops like corn. Agricultural crops, energy crops. I think it seems to me the forest use is much more defendable than food crops.
I think that's a general support for using woody biomass, that you can grow it on marginal sites. It does not it's not a direct competition with food, with fertile land. You can create it in an environment that has multiple uses, where you at the same time look at biodiversity issues and different kinds of ecosystem services, and you're not necessarily and you have a very extensive form of producing it, also material and labor-wise extensive.
You didn't look at all into short rotation biomass.
Not included here because the at least our assumption here was that you have in Vermont just 20% open land. Most of that is not in agriculture, as far as I understand anymore. So you probably don't have a lot of room to expand and to look into marginal sites, agricultural sites that might be candidates for reforestation or something like short rotation woody crops.
Okay, and when you get to slopes like that, no, because of obvious erosion.
I mean, those slopes are already on the forest here, right? They are not
But we
open.
could level all the forests and get into high rotation, so. Oh, hey, there is gonna be a biomass conference here?
Yeah, that is
You wanna say
right.
something about
Good
that?
point. So the 28th to 29th of April, I believe, that's a Friday and Thursday, there's a Biomass Bioenergy conference here in the Davis Center, organized in the first case by Cecilia Danks. And it's the focus is on science around bioenergy use from forests. There's also some papers have been submitted on short rotation woody crops, willow applications. The State University of New York does a lot of it, and it tackles all kinds of problems. There's forest supply, stuff that I just did here, there's some talk about economics, there's talk about health implications of using biomass in home applications or schools. There is carbon implications of forest cuts on forest soils, and how this would change carbon fluxes. So it's a whole range, and actually the website is already up. I think if you Google Bioenergy Symposium UVM, you should get to it. And the abstracts are also listed already.
What's the, can you just see that report again?
Yep.
Or at least the title page?
Yep.
Well, this, I mean, your result is gonna raise some hackles. This, if your numbers are good, I assume they're good, this is a real advance and a real shock.
It is, yeah. So the numbers that we've seen so far in forest estimates are much higher. I can't recall comparisons for Vermont right now. I know that I think, can I look again? The numbers that we produced for New York are the realistic scenario, which is a very conservative, careful scenario, is something like 660,000 tons of biomass. The numbers that I've seen so far for these kinds of estimates go up to 7 million. So a factor of 10. And
Wow. You sure you
For-
dropped that factor 10?
if that would be the case, it would be Charlie's fault, not mine. Charlie can't. But I'm very, very trusting actually of the way he tackled this. The last time there was a big outcry was when Massachusetts issued was it the Energy Department or the Environment Department of the state of Massachusetts issued a study. They wanted to know if they should hand out more permits for power plants that want to produce electricity from biomass. And that report was published May, I think, last year. It's the Manomet report. It's called the Manomet report. If you're interested, just Google Manomet report, Massachusetts. And they actually were also on the low end for the estimates. They produced the estimate for Massachusetts of something like 400,000 tons of biomass per year. We came up with, I think, 300 for Massachusetts. No, 200 to 300. So these are very low numbers, no question. And of course, this Massachusetts report created a huge uproar of the forest industry, especially from Maine. Came a lot of talk.
Wasn't there another issue in that report as well, which is that we're gonna cut a lot of standing forests in a hurry, which meant there was gonna be a big pulse of carbon?
The carbon part was the big emphasis of this report, and again, that's something that I didn't even talk about, if biomass is carbon neutral or not, which in the first case depends a lot on if you do additional cuts, or if you have uses for biomass that was already cut for other reasons and becomes available now for biology, like secondary uses in paper mills or sawmills,
For which you need a dynamic model.
for which you would need a very dynamic model.
Well, we should probably wrap it up, but can't you assume that all of them eventually decays and releases CO2?
And there the time frame plays a big role. How long would that, for example, take? What's your baseline? What would you assume here? How does the forest grow if you wouldn't cut it at all? That should be your baseline probably. And that's actually, that is the cutting edge of carbon dynamic research right now.
Sorry to keep going, but anyway, did you ever hear Bill, I think it was Nordhaus, the economist, who talked about pickling wood?
I'm burying it.
I'm very,
Yeah.
I heard all kinds of
Grow it,
things
you
already.
dump some chemical on it so it can't rot. And you go smoke.
We're gonna petrify all the wood while the new petrified
Yeah,
forest.
so you're kind of producing new fossil fuel for the distant future.
Petrified wood, all the carbon is already gone.
Oh, yeah, it's been calcified, yeah.
That's not also, no, this is,
Which proves my point, which is it all eventually decays, all of it. Even this will eventually turn.
Did you look at what, I saw an interesting thing on Pennsylvania on, because they have such high deer populations in some areas, because I'm assuming with biomass it's gonna be more like clear cut styles, or is it selective? I mean, to get at a price of $25, I can't imagine doing very much selective cutting.
And there you're talking again about what's the economic drive of doing these cuts?
But the stuff, the $25 a ton stuff is chips and waste.
Right, so that's,
Right.
these are products that are created because you would go in for saw timber. And then, of course, the question is, do you just cut out now the saw timber log and produce some biomass from the top, so from those segments that would not meet your criteria for saw timber? Or do you also think about thinning operations where you actually try to create environments where you increase productivity of the remaining stand, which will also be more a selective cut, or if you just try to maximize your biomass output, and then
Like pulp operations,
and then right, and then you might have very heavy cuts, of course. And I was fairly convinced until something like a year ago that these cuts that are performed right now in the Northeast are actually highly dependent on the saw timber market, and only if that market is viable you will have biomass cuts. But then I saw the video on I think YouTube of the McNeil power plant. They had their anniversary, 25 years of production, and they interview a logger, and this logger explains that they just had done a cut that was a pure biomass cut. So it was the first time that I heard of that, on 600 acres.
Oh,
So then he was talking about
that's a square mile.
so what you can do is you can increase your whole size of the cut, or you can intensify your cut, or you can do both.
that was a selective on 600 acres,
That,
or?
I don't know what it was, but it was only for biomass, none of the other products.
I thought
And
that's
it
what they
seemed
do
that
for me.
that's in the end how it works. If you want just to go in for biomass, you need to have huge cuts or intensive cuts. But that's speculative.
I got it. If that's true, then we've been hoodwinked, because that's a square mile. And
I mean, that was not a clear cut. I'm certain that this was not a clear cut because you can't do a clear cut of a square mile. But it was a stand that was affected of the size of 600
so maybe
acres.
there's a-
I'm not saying that this was a clear cut, not at all. I'm looking more from the economics perspective at this, and that I was surprised to hear that a pure biomass cut with these low prices that you would achieve for your biomass is actually feasible.
Maybe that's a thinning cut, and then they call it, then
Where
they
you
call
could
it waste.
call it as having a investment character, so you didn't really calculate to get revenues right from that cut, but you think about additional revenues further down the line when your saw timber can grow faster. But
Could it be a maple operation, trying to thin everything out?
that's the
not
thing.
maple?
What we've seen last year with field sampling for biomass cuts, that a lot of the cuts that were suggested to us were conversions to sugar bush.
And you were heading somewhere with a deer. and a-
Yeah, because it was in Pennsylvania, and they were showing in areas where, I don't remember what the raw numbers were, but where you have really high deer populations, their forest regrowth is severely, damaged. So I mean, there's also this management of browsing populations that we can use to make the forest healthier, but increase our growth.
That's a big issue
And
in
it's
Germany. as
very
well.
touchy, especially,
Oh yeah. Yeah. Good point.
I mean, especially in like Pennsylvania, because the amount of wood available in Pennsylvania was pretty high.
Very good growing conditions. Yeah. And actually also a fairly high stocking in Pennsylvania, not too degraded.